As we continue to think about the 7 deadly sins, or capital vices, and think today about avarice, these words of Jesus in verse 15 grab our attention. Take care, be on guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. We all want abundant life, and Jesus promises us abundant life, but many of us seek an abundant life through abundant possessions. But the reality is that abundant possessions cannot provide abundant life. If it could, the arithmetic of happiness would go something like this. Think of the man in the parable. 1 barn makes me 10% happy. Therefore, if I have 10 barns, I should be 100% happy. But that's not the way it works, is it? It's not the way it works. Because of avarice, the word more becomes a 4-letter word for us. Our addiction to things accelerates, and it can never be satisfied. Never be satisfied. I think, when I think of this problem, I think of a politician in the Philippines. Her name is Imelda Marcos, and 20 years ago, before his death, she was the wife of the president of the Philippines. But I see you nodding your heads, so you know where I'm going with this. The thing I remember most about her was that as her husband's regime was falling apart, her greediness was exposed primarily through her obsession with shoes. She had 2,700 pairs of shoes. 2,700 pairs of shoes. It raises the question, how many pairs of shoes can you wear at one time? As I said to the children, how many toys can you play with at one time? How many shoes can you wear at one time? How many houses does it take to shelter one person? How many cars can you drive at one time? The problem is that our desire for things is a desire for more, and it becomes insatiable. Avarice also affects us in another way. We begin to see things that are really luxuries as necessities. Many, many years ago, when I became a pastor, I needed a car, and I got my first new car, and I was very proud of it, and it had a wonderful device for opening and closing the windows. I would go like this. Later on, I had a car where I pushed a little button and the window went up and down, and somehow that button now seems like a necessity when the handle was just as good at getting that window up and down. We tend to take luxuries and make them into necessities in our life. Think for a minute, if you will, of all the things you have now that you consider necessities that 30, 40 years ago were luxuries. You didn't really need them, but now you see them as necessities. That's one of the ways that avarice affects us. We live in a world full of things. And how does a Christian deal with things in a way that we are able to avoid the greediness that is exemplified by my little nephew, Peter? Well, I think we have no choice but to live in this world, but we are called to live differently than other people because we are Christian. And one of the ways we're called to live differently is we're called to live without anxiety. The rich fool in the parable that Jesus told wasn't sure that there would be enough for him later on, and so he hoarded it. This wasn't a reasonable savings plan for the future he had in mind. He simply wanted all the goodies for himself. The anxiety of the rich fool is exactly the opposite of the way we're to live. We're to live in a trusting relationship with God, knowing that God will continue to provide our needs. G.K. Chesterton once said that there are 2 ways to get enough. One is to accumulate more and more. although I would argue with him at that point. I'm not sure that anybody thinks that they don't need more, no matter how much they have. But he goes on to say the other way is to desire less. And that's where our Christian lifestyle comes in, as we place limits on ourselves. And the reality in life is that when we're willing to live simply, it's not that hard. Thoreau at Walden said, "If man lives by the sweat of his brow, he sweats easier than I do." He discovered at Walden Pond that if you live simply, it's not that hard to meet your needs. Christians are to live non-anxiously, trusting in God. I think Christians, if we want to avoid the pitfalls of avarice or greed, we also need to recognize that we have choices. We have choices that can make a difference in the way our lives are lived. There was a cartoon in the New Yorker magazine a number of years ago, and it showed two men on the street. One was dressed in a fine suit, had a beautiful tie on, an expensive-looking hat, was carrying a leather briefcase, and he had really nice shoes on. Standing next to him was a man who had a ball cap, a t-shirt, blue jeans, and a backpack, and some running shoes on. But the cartoonist had placed a price tag on all the items that each of them were wearing. The man dressed in the fancy suit had an outfit that cost $2,358, and the man in the ball cap had an outfit that cost $98. We sometimes think we don't have choices, but we really do have choices that can make a great difference in how we handle our lives in the material realm. When we're buying a car or buying a house or buying anything, we have choices that we can make. And simply recognizing that we do have control is a first step in getting control. I think Christians approach the material world in another way, which is different than many in this life. And that is that Christians see investing in life as an attitude. The rich fool in the parable hoarded everything that he could get his hands on. He reminds me of a little boy at coffee hour in one of my churches. He took one of the styrofoam cups for coffee, and he went over to the dessert table where there were donut holes, and he began to put donut holes in the styrofoam cup. And he put one in, he put two in, he put three in, he put four in, then he mashed them down a little bit, and he put another one in and mashed it down and put another. He got eight of those donut holes in the one cup. He was essentially hoarding donut holes for himself. Now that's kind of silly and pathetic, but no more silly or pathetic than Ebenezer Scrooge before his redemption. We need to invest in life. There once was a millionaire in Texas who had given many millions of dollars to one of the educational institutions there, and later when the business climate changed, he went bankrupt, and someone said to him, "Well, aren't you sorry that you gave away all those millions of dollars?" He said, "Absolutely not. The only way to preserve that wealth was to give it away. If I had kept it, it would have been lost in the bankruptcy with everything else. The only way to preserve it is to give it away." Isn't that what Jesus said? The only way we preserve our life is to give it away. Greed hurts us. It makes us unhappy. Do you realize that the word miserable has as its root word miser? To be a miser is to be miserable. Just ask Ebenezer Scrooge. Being greedy hurts us. In 1886, Leo Tolstoy wrote a little short story about a peasant. His name was Pahom. And he didn't have any land, and he thought, gosh, he would just be happy if he could get his hands on a few acres that belonged to him. And he got those few acres, but then he realized that he thought maybe he'd be happier if he got a few more acres. And so he got a few more acres, and pretty soon he heard about a place far away where land was cheap. And he could get as much land as he could walk around in one day for 1,000 rubles. So he went to this place, and he put down his 1,000 rubles, but as the day progressed, he wanted a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and he had to complete the circuit in order to get the land that he had walked around. And he had to do it before the sun set. And as he continued his journey, he became more and more frightened. He wouldn't get back to the starting point. He began to run, even though the day was hot, and he had to run uphill. And just as he got back to the starting point, he dropped dead of a heart attack. The title of the story was How Much Land Does a Man Need? And the punchline was the last line of the story. His servant took a spade and dug his grave. He needed 6 feet from his head to his toe. That's how much land a man needs. Greed hurts us, and Tolstoy knew that and tried to explain that. People who are hoarders live out of fear. Others listen to the voice of self-gratification, and that leads to dissatisfaction in their life. Not only does greed hurt us personally, it hurts our relationship with other people. The root word for greed in Greek is pleonexia, and it's the same root word for the verb to cheat. To cheat. Greed hurts our relationship with other people in the way we get things. Think of Bernie Madoff. Thousands of investors losing billions of dollars because of his greed. Greed hurts our relationship with others. It hurts our relationship with others in the way we fail to share with those around us. The word avarice ends in the letters I-C-E, and greed is an icy, deadly sin. It shuts up our compassion. It closes our eyes to the need around us. It makes us ingrown as people. I have discovered over the years that some of the happiest people I know are people who are generous. Generosity makes us joyful. Jesus said, "Be on guard against all kinds of greed." We need to be on guard. We need to be conscious of what drives our consumption. We need to listen to the faithful voices of Christian witness throughout the century as opposed to the pitchmen who shovel 30-second ads to us. We need to listen to the scriptures rather than those inner voices that tell us we want more. And in so doing, we need to recognize the source of the things that sustain us. All that we have and all that we are, every skill and gift we have comes from God. And so we ought to live with thankfulness, not in fear of scarcity. And we need to remember that God is the source of true satisfaction and the only real peace that we will ever find. As St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless, and they will be restless until they find their rest in God. Now, as you listen to the parable that Jesus told, you may say to yourself, "Gosh, that seems extreme. That's not me at all." But I'd like you to look in the mirror and ask yourself, how do I, as an individual, live lives that are like that greedy person? Do I have a right relationship with things in this world? Throughout Lent, we're talking about how to get self-control over capital vices, and in this case, the vice of avarice. Jesus says that when we are greedy, we are like the man, the rich fool. He says, "So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." Our goal should be to become rich toward God, to be free from more, the symptom of wanting more, to find our peace and contentment in God's love and the joy of living generously. Let's pray together.